English colonial homes will go through their own evolution, and that's not surprising. Of course, when you get off the boat, imagine yourself at Plymouth Rock, for example. When you get off that boat, you're going to need a few things. One of the first things you need is sleeping quarters. And so we're going to start with very simple construction and build up from there as people have more resources available. So we start with the Hall house. This is a one-room house. If you go inside, it's going to be very similar to what we saw in medieval Europe. It's going to be very similar to what we saw from the Aztec. It's very similar to any number of different cultures. You would have the kitchen and the living quarters and the sleeping quarters all in the same place. Much like a great hall, that one place serves as everything. So you pull out your sleeping materials, you sleep at night, you put them away, you do your work during the day, you can cook, etc. You get the idea. These are very simple homes, but there's always going to be a fireplace or chimney at one end, in this case hidden by a tree, but you can kind of see it back there. Inside, very, very simple construction. Everything is post and lintel. It's all pragmatic. It's all about making sure I have a safe place to live. And the floors, incidentally, are typically dirt at this point, but they will become wood, usually variable width beam. So in other words, you can put varying widths of wood down for your floor, but again, very simple and straightforward. That will develop into the hall and parlor house. Very, very simple construction. The idea is you put a fireplace in the middle. One side is the hall, one side is the parlor. The parlor is going to be the sort of formal space. The hall is that multi-purpose space. The parlor is where you would do any number of things, from holding a funeral, because that would typically happen in the home, to bringing in guests, to entertaining, etc. And there's a couple of different layouts that we see. You might have a center passage, very common in the South. So the idea was I could open the door and let the air blast through, especially in an age before air conditioning. That's very, very useful. If you have, then you could have a center chimney where it's all effectively one room, but that chimney is in the center. And then you have the hall entry where you actually enter into the hall, but the parlor is around the other side. They do have attic spaces, but that's frequently going to be used for sleeping. Then we have the I house. Now this is going to become very, very common. This is that second floor being added to our hall and parlor, something that we're going to see especially in the Northeast. And what they're doing is very simple construction. This is still one room deep. So one side is the hall, one side is the parlor. You can see the two chimneys on either side. But now they've moved the sleeping quarters upstairs. And there's still an attic space that's going to be used somewhat for storage, but more often than not, that's extra space for drying goods or doing whatever needs to be done, or other storage. Cold storage would usually be in a cellar or something dug down beneath the house, not above. Now, the I house will have an interesting feature, and many of these houses will, called the summer beam. We see one here. This is a massive 12-inch by 12-inch oak beam. And this is an idea that they get from shipbuilding, from the English. It's not terribly surprising. And what the summer beam does is it runs across the house. So it starts on one exterior wall and typically runs into the chimney on the opposite wall. It can be in a basement, it can be on a first floor, it sort of depends on the construction that you're using. And from that summer beam, all of the floor joists fan out from there. So we see those coming off the top here, although sometimes they're actually inset into the summer beam. Now, this would be, one of those major structural beams today. And today we would see this made of MDF. We would see this made of iron. Sometimes you see those metal columns in someone's basement. That's probably the modern equivalent of a summer beam today. Now, we see a lot of additions because, of course, they're building their practical home and then they're going to add to it as needed. And those additions frequently break the lines but make something that is very interesting to look at. Here you can tell where the original house is and then the additions, not just the edge that we see in the siding, but you can see the roof line is different, the height is different, sometimes the window sizes are different, and that's very, very common because, of course, they're expanding as their family expands, as their needs change. They simply add on to the house. These are very skilled people. Oftentimes, they can add on to the house themselves or with a couple of friends. So I want to look at some other forms. The salt box house. Now, this is going to be something very, very common in the Northeast, although we'll see it in the South as well. And what we do is we start with our I-beam house or our I-house, and we put an addition on it. And we simply continue that roof line. Sometimes it continues in a straight line. Sometimes you will see it bend at a slightly different angle. But either way, it's always an addition. Later on, they will use it as its own form, as its own style. And to give you an idea of what's going on, these salt box houses are about 1700 to 1760, which means neoclassical doesn't exist yet. But here we see a neoclassical entryway that has been tacked on to this salt box home. And it's possible that the salt box addition is tacked on to an earlier I house. And I should point out, this is called a salt box home because it just looks generally like the salt boxes they have at the time. Now, in terms of general characteristics, we often see a central chimney, and that's a carryover from our hall and parlor house. We're going to see a symmetrical layout of the windows when seen from the front with a central wooden door. We're going to see 3 to 4 rooms on the ground floor. So now we're 2 rooms deep on the ground floor. And then we're going to see 2 to 2.5 rooms on the second floor. And then usually there's an attic space above it. So very simple idea from the outside. From the inside, of course, you can play with those spaces, but we're seeing that evolution as it happens. Now, in the Northeast, especially in areas where the English are coming over early on, we will see the Garrison House. This is going to have that jetty. So that area where the house is jutting out from its base, this is a carryover from Tudor England, from the English Renaissance, where they were doing it because they were charged based on where the ground floor is, not based on the airspace above. So we get the Garrison House. Now, frequently, this will have what's called a drop. So there will be a little ornamentation here, frequently something in an oak motif or a pineapple dropping off, just a nice little decorative piece. And the home that you see here, you can see that salt box addition that's been added to it. So we get these mix of styles, a Garrison House with a salt box addition, etc. Things get very, very complicated when we get into what is effectively a hybrid society in the Americas. Then we have the Cape Cod. Now, the Cape Cod is a very simple form, but it is very practical. It is your basic hall and parlor. But we have a central chimney. We generally have maybe 1 room, maybe 2 rooms on either side. You will notice there are no eaves, so it's a very shallow eave. That's because of the weather and wind. Of course, this is coming from the Massachusetts coast, so you don't want the wind coming in and blowing the roof off of your house. They will also frequently have picket fences out front. And imagine that I live on Cape Cod. I'm going to have a lot of sand blowing, and I want to break that sand. So it's going to pile up along the picket fence instead of piling up along the house, or worse, inside the house. Now, the Cape Cod will give way or evolve eventually into the Cape Ann, which is a similar form. Here, this is a modern Cape Ann. But what you see is the use of that broken roof, which they're getting from the Dutch Colonial. And sometimes we will have what's called a rainbow roof, so this will actually arc out on some occasions. But what this does is it opens up that second floor. So now I can have a much wider span on the second floor, and now I can have 2 rooms deep as we move forward. And of course, this is just storage space anyway.